Texas Pete and I finished our through in two on Friday, 2 days ago, and it is good to be home. We spent our last 4 or 5 days walking through Georgia, and I could not help but thinking about the hype that the Georgia Appalachian Trail gets from northbounders. And it left me wondering, how hard was Georgia really? Northbounders give a lot of hype to a lot of places on the trail. Georgia's one of them, how difficult it is, the rocks of Pennsylvania, the mud of Vermont, the length of Virginia. They even throw shade at the 100-mile wilderness, which they say is the first half is really a lot of terrain and the second half is roots and rocks. And we found, as flip-floppers starting in New Jersey, that a lot of the sections of trail didn't really live up to the hype. And in fact, like Pennsylvania, for example, we were halfway through all the rocks before we were finally like, oh wait, this is what everybody's talking about. So it turned out not to be that big a deal. So I decided, coming south through Georgia, that I was actually going to do a little analysis on the Appalachian Trail and see if I couldn't put Georgia in its place, like quantitatively. So we could decide once and for all, is Georgia as hard as people say it is or not? And so I want to show you what I found and how I found it. I used 4 tools to do this analysis. I used a random number generator along with AWOL's AT guide. I used Gaia GPS mapping software, and then I just used Google Sheets to do a little bit of mathematical analysis. So I'm going to walk you through what I did to start. First, I did a random number generator that chose a random number between 0 and 2,119, which this is 75 miles south of Katahdin. So the sections of trail I studied were 75 miles long. I would take the number, like for example 2087, and I would study the 75 miles of trail north of that point. So in that way I generated 10 samples of trail, and here they are in no particular order. These are just 75 mile sections of trail. I mapped them on Gaia GPS, and I looked at the total ascent, and so I was able to calculate the ascent per mile. And from that, I was able to calculate an average ascent per mile and then the standard deviation. Both of these are in feet per mile. And we can see what those look like on the map. Here they are on Gaia GPS. And so some of these sections overlap one another, which is kind of to be expected. But you can see that all of them are pretty well spaced out around the trail. So it turns out to be a pretty good random sampling of sections on the Appalachian Trail. A quick note on why I chose to do 75 miles. Gaia marks the Georgia Appalachian Trail as 75.1 miles long, which is a little shorter than what either the AT Guide or the Far Out app say. But for the purposes of analysis and comparison, I didn't really think it would be that big of a difference. So I just kind of used a standard 75.1 miles of trail for my sample size. So I got 10 samples of Appalachian Trail, and I found their total ascent. Okay, the next thing I did is I just started looking at sections of trail that might be interesting to us. And so I'm going to show you a collection of those sections of trail now. So I've changed up the map a little bit over here. I have maybe about 10 or 12 different sections of trail shown on the map. Some are a little smaller than others, and some a little bit longer. Here is the Virginia Triple Crown is only about 30 miles long, and here's Shenandoah is 105. I've got the 4-state challenge in there. Here is a section of trail in Connecticut and Massachusetts that I thought might just be average. And then we get up here into New Hampshire and Maine. Here's the 100-mile wilderness. So this is just some sections of trail that are kind of famous or well-known. And then I looked at those numerically. So just to give you an example of what I found here, I started with the Wildcats and the Carters. That's a 45-mile section of trail between Pinkham Notch and Grafton Notch. And I calculated the ascent per mile to be 381, which gave it a z-score of 99.13. So here's what this means. This z-score is the percent of trail that is easier than the Wildcats and Carters. 99.13% of the trail is easier than that section of trail, which if you've hiked the Wildcats and Carters, then you're like, oh yeah, for real. That is a brutal section of trail in terms of vertical ascent. Then I thought I'm going to pick a section of trail that might be a little bit on the easier side. So I looked at Shenandoah, Rockfish Gap to Front Royal. It's a longer section of trail, but you won't be surprised to find out that it's harder than only 34% of the rest of the trail, 33. So what this number means is that based on vertical ascent only, that this section of trail is more difficult than only 33% of the rest of the trail. The Smokies, unsurprisingly, rank in at almost 80%. It's more difficult than 80% of the trail. And then we just looked at a couple of other things. Here's the 4-state challenge, pretty easy. Baxter and I were really enjoying the Nantahala watershed from like Wyabald all the way around almost to Deep Gap, North Carolina. I did that southbound because that's the way we hiked it. That would make a difference in the analysis. And so it was on the easier side of things. Maybe we were just in trail shape. I tried to pick an average section of trail, and I got pretty close here. That was in the 44th percentile. And then Baxter asked about the Triple Crown. We looked at Southern Maine, which unsurprisingly is about the same as the Carters and Wildcats. These two might actually overlap. I'm not sure. Maybe not. I have a friend going in August to do the Presidential Traverse, and I don't think I got it exactly right, but here's the southbound Presidential Traverse. It's more difficult than 99.8% of the Appalachian Trail. Admittedly, this section of trail isn't purely AT, and the AT skirts a lot of these peaks instead of going over them like the Presidential Traverse does. But at any rate, the Prezzies rank in at about the most difficult section of trail you could get. And then I looked at the 100-mile wilderness for fun. The 100-mile wilderness, in terms of elevation gained, is more difficult than only 16% of the rest of the trail. And we loved the 100-mile wilderness. We thought that it was really just spectacular and enjoyable. We did our first 2 20-mile days there. This does not include all of the routes and rocks and stream crossings, the remoteness, the resupply. All these things can be factored into to talk about the difficulty of the trail. This is only studying vertical feet of elevation. Okay, which brings us to our section of trail. How hard is Georgia really? So the 75 miles of trail in Georgia have 21,000 feet of vertical elevation gain, and it puts Georgia in almost the 74th percentile. Okay, this means that Georgia is more difficult than almost 3/4 of the Appalachian Trail. So you imagine a northbounder getting on the trail, maybe very little experience hiking the AT. They have a heavy pack. They do not have any kind of trail legs, and they're setting out to tackle what is going to be far above average in terms of elevation gain and in difficulty of trail. And a lot of northbounders spend 10 or 12 days on this 80 miles of trail, just wrestling through, taking zeros, tweaking gear, trying to get resupply down. And so I'm thankful that when Texas Pete and I got there, that it was at least familiar to us. We slack packed quite a bit of it. We had our trail legs, and we were coming home. So maybe throw down in the comments there a section of trail that you'd like to see me put in the little analysis tool here. One that is maybe pretty difficult. I'd love some that are pretty easy, like what's the easiest section of trail out there? And then I'm still hunting for one that is just dead average. Like, can we find one on the AT that is the 50% mark? So put your suggestions in the comments, and I'll see if I can get an answer back to you. Georgia is difficult.